you ask, why the hell did anybody get interested in mistletoes? I mean, you know, why on earth was it? I'll learn to use this button in a minute. Well, I grew up in Kenya, and I grew up mentored by a guy called John Williams, who was curator of birds at the National Museum there. But he was also an all-round naturalist, and he was very keen on butterflies, particularly a family of butterflies called Lycaenids, which are little blue things. And his son and I, if we were silly enough to find a mistletoe, and we used to have to look for mistletoes, if we were silly enough to find one, we'd have to search them leaf by leaf for the caterpillars of these breasted little butterflies that he was studying. And if we were silly enough to find one, we had to feed them and get them all the way to butterfly and then hand them over. So yeah, the butterflies was my introduction to mistletoes, really. And this is where's the button? Yeah, this is a Lycaenid butterfly. This is an Australian one, obviously, but its larvae feed on mistletoes. And this funny looking thing here is actually a Lycaenid larva, a Lycaenid caterpillar. And yeah, it wasn't only butterflies. These Jezebels, you probably know the Jezebels, do you? Their larvae feed on mistletoes as well. And I'm a bit of a birdo, so you know, I had to look for birds, and you know, so there were butterflies and there were birds, and of course they're beautiful. So that got me hooked. Why mistletoes? Okay, we've talked a bit about what happened when I was a kid in Kenya. But here in WA, I was interested in fire. One of my first jobs was regional, well, they called it regional superintendent, but these days it would be called regional manager for national parks before it got subsumed into the forest department and became Department of Calm. And I was posted to the Pilbara, and I ran the national parks in the Gascoyne, Pilbara and Kimberley. And I was very interested in what fire was doing to the environment, because it seemed to be nobody cared about it, particularly in the Pilbara. You know, if there was a fire, you just let it burn till it finished. And I was a bit worried about what it was doing to the environment. So I wanted to find somewhere where there were very mild fire regimes, so that I could compare with areas that I knew had heavy fire regimes. And I wondered if I could use mistletoes as surrogate, because mistletoes are very interesting. They're killed by fire, and they have, you know, everybody's got some means of surviving fire. They've got seeds in the ground or in Banksia nuts, or they've got epicormic shoots that come from under the bark. Everybody's got some means of surviving a fire, but mistletoes haven't. If a fire kills them, they're dead. And they can't store seed. Seed has to be planted by a bird while it's fresh on a branch of another tree. So if a fire's killed them, there's no seed store. There's nothing for them to survive. So I wondered if mistletoes could be a good surrogate for lightly burnt areas. If I found patches of lots of mistletoes, then I assumed that had a fairly mild fire regime, and I'd be able to. So I started looking for mistletoes in the Pilbara. Lycaenid butterflies, and who's who. This was 1984, the Flora of Australia put out the volume that covered mistletoes. The accounts were written by a guy called Henry Barlow. No, sorry. Not Henry Barlow, it was another Barlow, Brian Barlow. Henry Barlow was another bloke. He put out this Flora of Australia, and that was wonderful. I could actually look up the mistletoes. Good, I had a modern key. Help, some of the things I was finding went in it, or they didn't appear to be. I'd key them out and I'd come to something that simply said, oh dear, the map, it wasn't on the maps where I was working. I thought, this is a bit of a worry. So I had to fix some of those maps. There's a couple of maps out of the flora there, and you can see this is Amyema preissii, which is the thing that's flowering everywhere in this fellow. This lovely red thing, you've probably seen them all in the acacias everywhere. Does anybody want to have a look? There we go. And as you can see, this was pretty much a road map, wasn't it? There's the Great Eastern Highway, and there's roads around here, and it's so, you know. And one of the commonest ones I had in the Pilbara was this thing called Amyema Fitzgeraldii. And look, there's no dots at all in the Pilbara. And I was wondering, you know, scratching my head, is this really Amyema Fitzgeraldii? I keyed out to that. And then there was another one called Amyema hilliana. Don't worry about the names. But when I started doing this, the map had one dot there in the Bali Range, and it had one dot in the near Alice Springs, somewhere in the Territory. And this is where I found that thing. So we're starting to fill the maps in. This is actually a map out of Florabase. You're probably familiar with Florabase. That's just a Florabase map. Okay, so much for why I started looking at mistletoes. I'd like to just sort of introduce mistletoes in context of parasitic plants. Now, if you look, there are two lots of groups of parasitic plants. There's holoparasites, which are fully parasitic. They have no green leaves. They get all their nutrients, everything from their host plant. And then there are hemiparasites, and they're semi-parasitic. They've got green leaves, like that Amyema preissii that I passed around. They've got green leaves, and they photosynthesize, but they get their water and they get their mineral nutrients from their hosts. And then the second group is there are root parasites, things that parasitize the roots of their hosts. And there are stem parasites, which parasitize the stems of their hosts. And that one that's growing in the acacias that's flowering at the moment, that's obviously a stem parasite. Okay? So let's look at a few of these parasites. Holoparasitics, the root parasites that get all their nutrients from their hosts. You probably all know these fellows, do you? The broom rapes? Yeah. Oh, I love them. I reckon they're beautiful. Oh. And then there's a wonderful thing called Pilostyles. Now, Pilostyles, this one comes from up near Inhabit, and they're just tiny. They just live in their hosts all the time. This one on a Jacksonia, and once a year they'll burst through the bark, and a little bud will come out, and it'll open flower, and then it'll fruit, and it'll drop off, and that's the end of it. All the rest of it's inside the tissues of its host. And there's one that's quite common up here and all through the Jarrah forest, Pilostyles hamiltonii. And do you know that Pilostyles? I've got a little bit here for you to pass around. Lots of people mistake it. They're these little things down at the bottom. Lots of people go through the bush and they think, oh, that poor plant's covered in scale. It's not scale at all. It's actually this Pilostyles. And they've got lovely little white flowers. Oops. Wrong button. I'll get there. The flowers are actually little white things, and the purple things you can see here are mostly buds. They haven't quite opened yet, but when they do open, they've got these tiny little white flowers. And when they finish, they just sort of form a seed, and it doesn't look much different. Okay, so that's the holoparasites. Let's look at some hemiparasitics. There are lots of root parasites that are hemiparasitic. There's quandongs, for instance, and our Christmas tree. You all know the Christmas tree. They're all root parasites. They parasitize the roots of their hosts. And interestingly, a lot of those root parasites, like the Christmas tree, they send out these long runners just about the ground surface, just under the ground, and they'll shoot from those runners. So sometimes you'll see an area where there's a whole lot of Christmas trees. They're probably all clones from one original plant that might have died 1,000 years ago, because they just keep sending out these roots and these suckers. Those of us who live in Roleystone, you probably know the hill down Mills Road. Halfway down, there's a lovely patch of santalums, and they're all root parasites, and I think they're probably all clones from one original plant. So they're fun. Yeah, there's the Christmas tree, but the Christmas tree is not a parasite. It's in the same family as a lot of our mistletoes. Oh, sorry, it is a parasite. It's not a mistletoe. It's in the same family as most of our mistletoes, but it's not, because it's a root parasite, not a stem parasite. The mistletoes are stem parasites. And then the broom rape family has got some very interesting plants. This is a striga, which is quite a common plant in the spinifex, particularly in the Kimberley, but also in the Pilbara. And they're just root parasites. So if you walk along, you see these lovely white flowers, and you think, they're just an ordinary plant. They're not parasitic at all. It's only if you dig them up that you find that their roots are attaching onto the roots of the grasses and things that they're growing amongst. And strigers, there's some brilliant strigers. There's some beautiful purple and brilliant crimson ones that are quite common in Africa. And they're a real pest there, because those strigers can reduce maize crops of struggling African communities by up to 30%. So they're beautiful flowers, but they're problems. Okay, so what are mistletoes? We've decided that they've got green leaves, so they're hemiparasitic, and they're stem parasites. That's what they are functionally. Botanically, we've got two families that contain mistletoes in WA, two distinct families. We've got the Santalaceae, which is the same family as the Santalums, the quandongs and sandalwoods and things. They used to be, the mistletoe bits used to be in the, the mistletoe bits used to be in a family called the Viscaceae. But modern genetic work has shown that the Viscaceae are really just Santalaceae. So they've all been swamped into Santalaceae now. And they're the classic mistletoes of Europe, the ones that, you have they have at Christmas time. And I think they're probably around at Christmas time because they're a symbol of fertility. All the trees that they grow in there are deciduous. So in the middle of winter, the only things that have got green leaves in a lot of the trees are the mistletoes. So they're seen as a fertility thing. And then in the same group, there's dwarf mistletoes in America, and we've got two Santalaceous mistletoes here in southern WA, and there are three in this family in the Kimberley. And then all the rest of the mistletoes, like this showy one here, they're in the family Loranthacae, and they're sometimes called the showy mistletoes because they are beautiful. Here's one of the little mistletoes in the Santalaceae in southern WA. This is a thing called Corthalcella arthroclada, and it grows only in Melaleucas up near Inhabit. And here it is. You can see it's a very tiny little thing, and you can see here they've got tiny little fruits, and the flowers are even smaller. And these little bracts here, go back one. You can see the leaves are no more than these little bracts. They're these little scaly things here, and these are the fruits developing. And there's a flower there. See the little flower? So they're very small, and as you can see, and they hide well in their trees. And that tree had 20-30 mistletoes in it, 20 or 30 of these little Corthalcellas in it. And you can't see them. And funnily enough, there's neighbouring trees won't have them. One tree will maybe have lots in them. And the other Corthalcella we've got in southern WA is this thing, which is another Corthalcella. It's called Corthalcella leucotrix, which is known from 3 locations in Western Australia. One's Wanara Rock up near Mount Gibson. And this is where this photo was taken. And you can see the size, it's a bit bigger than the other one. And the trees get very heavily infested. And the interesting thing about these little mistletoes is that you've probably all heard of mistletoe birds feeding on the mistletoe berries, but the berries in these, the fruits in these things are far too small to interest birds. And they expel their seeds with hydrostatic pressure. Pressure builds up and they pop them out. And so you find underneath the trees, there's the seed, and there's the whole fruit of one of these things. And if you look around underneath the trees, you find all these little seeds that have pinged out, and they're sticky, just like the other mistletoes, and they stick to the branches, and you find this sort of swarm of little white seeds scattered on everything. The Kimberley ones in the Viscaceae belong to the genus Viscum, which is the same as the European mistletoe, and they're much bigger, and they have fruits that attract birds, nice big juicy things. And as you can see, mistletoe birds put strings of these little things. And in this photo, it's actually quite interesting. You see these little sort of worm-like things. They're the seeds they've just started germinating. Obviously, they're not going to go anywhere because they're not stuck to a host. But if they were stuck on a suitable host branch, then they'd tap into the host branch and they'd grow into a new plant. But okay, let's look at some of the showy mistletoes because they're really the interesting ones. Just quick look at this. Don't worry about the names and things. It's just interesting. There's those are the species we've got in southern WA, and you can see that all except 2 occur in the eastern states. So that a lot of mistletoes tend to be very widespread things. And you can see that even in Western Australia, they occur in lots of different areas, throughout arid areas, Murchison, Gascoyne, goldfields. This one's most of mainland Australia. It's not that common, but it occurs in the Kimberley. It's very common all through the Pilbara and the deserts, all the way down to the southern parts. And I'll just run quickly through the mistletoes we've got in this part of the world. This is a thing called Lyciana casuarini. And as the name suggests, it grows in casuarinas. You find it and you can see it in the middle of the city, in the casuarinas along the foreshore of the Swan. It's not particularly showy. It has these little yellowy buds, but there's another form of casuarini which grows out all through the Murchison, the Gascoyne, and areas like that, which is really showy. And it's bright red flowers. You can pick it doing 100 k's an hour down the highway, and it's a really bright thing. And I think it's actually a different species, but it hasn't got a name yet. And the Lyciana casuarini, like a lot of mistletoes, has red berries. Red because it attracts birds. Birds like red fruits. It's the same reason a lot of the flowers are red on mistletoes. And this is Amyema fitzgeraldii, which is a beautiful thing. It's different in that it's got green flowers, but it's got these red filaments. And that's common in mulga. That's one of the ones, remember the map I showed you? The mulga, the one that's common in the mulga and all through the Pilbara and everywhere? This is that fellow. And it gets down to coal seam and places like that. It gets just north of Geraldton. It's quite common there. And it also has beautiful little berries, little pink berries. And then we got to a thing called Amyema gibberella, and there are 2 varieties. This is variety tatii, which has got glabrous leaves. You can see the leaves here, and that grows only in hakeas. It's got these lovely woolly flowers. It's a very special plant. And this is the other form of gibberella, which has got hairs on the leaves as well as on the flowers. And they're really fantastic looking plants. And this is Amyema linophila. Linophila grows also in the casuarinas. It's quite common along the foreshores of the Swan River. Just if you stop off at Redcliffe Bridge on Tonkin Highway, there's a boardwalk, you can go along there. And both the Lyciana casuarini and this thing are very common in the trees all along there. And it lives only in the casuarinas. It doesn't go into ala casuarina even. I think I've got one record from hundreds that's in an ala casuarina, not a casuarina. But it does get into the casuarina pauper, which grows out through the goldfields and the Murchison and places like that. And then there's Amyema melaleucae. This is an interesting plant. It lives only in melaleucas. And its distribution is quite interesting. There's a population up near Shark Bay, which Joff and Joan found. And then it was once on Rottnest Island, and it's still on Garden Island. And then it disappears until you get round to Esperance. And then from Esperance all along that south coast, all the way into South Australia, you get this thing in the melaleucas. And I think the reason is that it's living in the melaleucas. It's usually lanceolata, and they grow along the coast. The lanceolata tends to grow in thickets, and when you get a fire in, it burns out the whole entire thicket. So you get a whole series of local extinctions until it's now disappeared from everywhere between Shark Bay and Esperance. It's no longer, or there are no records of it anywhere on the mainland. It's just on Rottnest Island and was on was on Rottnest. It's now still on Garden Island. So that's quite an interesting little fellow. And then, of course, Amyema preissii, which you're probably all familiar with, which is the common mistletoe in this part of the world that grows on eucalypts. It's the only one down here that grows on eucalypts. And that's the flowers, beautiful flowers. And this is a thing called miraculosa. I'm not quite sure why it's called miraculosa. It's got the tiniest little flowers. They're no more than about 1 centimetre long. But they have these beautiful little lemon yellow berries. And they grow more or less only in santalums. They do actually grow in other things. You find them in myoporums when you get up round Exmouth. But basically there are two subspecies. One is pretty much coastal, southwest, and the other one is much further inland, and it's got much bigger flowers. Otherwise it looks the same. And this is Amyema preissii, which is the one we're seeing everywhere, and it's always red. But sometimes you get these ones with yellow flowers instead of red flowers. I don't know why it is, but sometimes you get a plant with yellow flowers on it, and they have red berries as well, like most of the other mistletoes. And then there's Amyema nestor, which is perhaps the most beautiful of the lot, and that likes growing in mostly in acacias. And you get that as soon as you get past the Jarrah forest, and particularly if you go up a bit north of here, up into the wheat belt, you find nestor. The distribution of the Loranthaceous mistletoes is quite interesting. They're in South America, and they've just managed to migrate into the southern half of North America through Central America. There's a little relic population here in southern Europe, and they're very common in Africa, lots of them in Africa and Madagascar. And then they're all through Southeast Asia, and they're in Australia, and they get down into New Zealand. There are various groups. The very primitive ones, which have got different chromosome numbers, occur down here in South America, and New Caledonia over here, New Zealand, and a few on the east coast. And these very primitive ones were probably Gondwanan. They evolved in Gondwana. So when Gondwana broke up, there you are, South America, Africa, and Australia and New Zealand. That's where they came from. But most of the Australian ones, funnily enough, apart from these primitive ones, probably came off Gondwana on the Indian subcontinent. And when it crashed into the rest of Asia, they've managed to migrate all the way down through here and then down into Australia, probably through Cape York. So although we've got some mistletoes that probably go back to Gondwana days, most of them, like this preissii, this red one, they've probably evolved from things that came off Gondwana on the Indian plate and have migrated down through Southeast Asia back into Australia. And in WA, you can see this in here. You see in WA we've got 5 genera. In the Kimberley there are still 5 genera. In the arid zone there are 3 genera. When you get down in the southwest there's only 2 genera. And there's only 4 around the Perth. Whereas in species in WA we've got about 38 species. There are 21 in the Kimberley, 23 in the arid zone. And part of the reason for the arid zone is that they've got a mixture of things that have come down from the north and things that have come down the east coast and then migrated across into Western Australia, like that Amyema that I was mentioning, which has got this distribution from Shark Bay around to South Australia. That almost certainly came into Western Australia from the east. So that's augmented them. But when you get down into the southwest, there are just nine species. And when you get into the sort of Perth region, we've only got 4 here. And again, with the endemic species, WA we've got 5 endemics. In the Kimberley there are 3. In the arid zone there's 1. In the southwest there are no endemic species in the southwest. Let's look at a few ecological reasons. We've talked about fire a little bit and the problems with fire and their regeneration. And we'll talk about host specificity a little bit, and I'll talk about crypsis and mimicry because it's an interesting topic that I find particularly fascinating. And I'll talk a little bit about conservation, particularly roadsides and deserts, which are very important. And fire, when you get fires like that, this is in the Pilbara, when you get fires like that going through, it leaves that, and of course the mistletoes are gone. They're completely gone from these areas. And in fact, in the Pilbara, there are now very few mistletoes, except occasionally in mulga communities, because the mulga doesn't burn unless you get spinifex in the understory, in which case it does burn, and then you lose both the mulga and the mistletoes, and a few things in mangroves. But the rest of it, they've got no means of surviving in a fire like that. So how do they handle fire? There are various different strategies mistletoes use to handle fire. There's what I call the philanderers. They'll live with absolutely anybody. And the reason they get away with it is that the seed has to be carried into the burnt area by a bird after a fire. If it's going to regenerate, the birds have to take it in. And if you're a philanderer, you can live on anybody. Then it doesn't matter what the bird settles on when he puts his seeds. It's got a much better chance of actually being able to recolonize that burnt area if you've got that fire strategy. And they're quite fun. There's one 200-kilometre stretch of road in Karijini National Park where I found, I think it was 11 different species of mistletoe. 2 species of mistletoe from 11 different host species and 5 different host families. So they, as you can see, they'll live on anybody. And this actually worked very well before whitefella came and started changing fire regimes. When the blackfellas were burning, they used to burn small patches with different intensities, different times of year. And with little patches, there was lots of opportunity for recolonization, because these days these big fires go through and they kill all the mistletoes, and before mistletoes from adjacent areas can have their seeds carried into the fire, they're probably burnt as well. So, you know, you look at Google Earth, you can see the fire scars across the deserts, and they're just an interlocking thing that take out about just about everything. So those are the philanderers. And then there are the faithful. They stick to one safe host. And that host is to live in a fire-safe place. And the classic example is a thing called Amyema thalassia, which grows only on mangroves, mostly Avicennias. So they do get hammered by cyclones occasionally, but they actually do quite well. And they're perfectly safe from fire. So as long as you choose the right host, there's a lot of advantage in being very faithful. But then there are the playboys. They're not quite as bad as the philanderers, but they always have some steady, safe hosts. And some of those steady, safe hosts grow in places like rocky gorges or riparian areas along rivers where they seldom get burnt. And then they can live on lots of other things. So in good times, they can spread out. And in bad times, they retreat to these little refugia, these rocky gorges and things where they have hosts that can survive in those sort of places. Excuse me. Thank you for the water, somebody. And a few ecological. We've talked about fire and regeneration. We've talked a little bit about host specificity, how host specific mistletoes are. And then another topic that's increasingly interesting for me is crypsis or mimicry. And then we'll talk a little about deserts. The crypsis that you can see in here, this is one of the mistletoes that grows in a casuarina and is really quite well hidden. And there they are, they've got bright red flowers. And a lot of people have talked about crypsis, about mimicry, and they've used all the mistletoes that grow in eucalypts tend to have long, narrow leaves, rather like the eucalypts. And this has always been put down to mimicry, mimicking the host leaves, which is interesting. Because I wonder what they're hiding from. And most people have suggested they're hiding from possums. A lot of people have suggested insects, because insects actually eat far more mistletoe than possums ever ate, although possums do like mistletoes, they will eat them. But insects very often detect their suitable host plants to lay their eggs on, that their caterpillars can survive on, by chemical cues, they get through their feet. They don't pick them out by eyesight. So it has to be something that's, if they're going to be hiding as mimics, they've got to be hiding from something that's going to eat them. And most people have suggested that because the leaves are mimicking the leaves of their hosts, it must be the leaves that they're eating. So they've concentrated on things like possums, particularly in Australia, possums. And in fact, in New Zealand, they've got Australian possums, as you probably know. And a couple of their mistletoes have become very, very rare, almost extinct. And for a long time it was attributed to possums eating them. But in fact it wasn't really the possums. The real secret was they'd knocked out all their native birds. And the birds did the pollinating and the dispersing of seeds. And the possums just was, just a bit too much. But without the birds, there's no pollination, there's no dispersal of seeds. So it might not all just be possums. Just to give you an example, here's a tree in the Bickley Valley with lots of Amyema mequellii in it. And you can see it stands out a long way. But if you're going around at night or you haven't got colour vision, you don't see them. So there they are. Why is this? I think it's because not only have they got to hide from things like possums, but they've also got to show off to things like birds, because they depend on birds for pollination. Honey eaters pollinate the mistletoe flowers, and the birds also distribute the fruits. So it's no good being too good a mimic, to hiding too well, because the birds won't find you and you won't get your seeds distributed, or you won't even develop any seeds. So you've got to be visible to things like birds that you need, but at the same time hiding from things that are going to eat you. And here's another example of one that you see these sort of slightly more silvery olivey leaves here. Those are the mistletoe leaves, and this is in a cajeput. And all the rest of these green leaves are cajeput leaves. And it's hiding really well, but it has to show itself for the birds. So it's got these lovely bright red flowers, which the birds can spot. So the leaves are helping it to hide all the year, and the flowers will attract the birds when they need it. And they've also got red fruits. So when they need the fruit birds to distribute the fruits, lo and behold, they say, here I am, while they're still hiding from maybe possums, whatever, some herbivore. Bit about conservation. Many species are in trouble. You can go for hundreds of kilometres through the Pilbara and through the deserts now and not see a mistletoe. All the hosts are there because they've all managed to survive the fire, but successive fires have eliminated them from huge areas. We talked about that Amyema melaleuca with the funny distribution from Shark Bay and then again Esperance through to South Australia. I think that one's in trouble. And then deserts, it's mostly fire. But in New Zealand we've talked about possums and birds. The possums are in and they're eating the mistletoes, but the birds have gone, so the mistletoes aren't reproducing. The good news is in WA, none are about to become globally extinct. They've all got somewhere they can hide, somewhere they can survive. There's one or two possible exceptions in the Kimberley. The young Joff there, Joff and Joan, they found a thing called Amyema, Dendropteri furcata, growing over the track into the Mitchell Plateau. And it was the only West Australian record for that species. It occurs in the Territory and it occurs in Queensland. But in WA, that was the one and only plant. And what happened the next year, a fire came through and wiped it out. Fortunately, they've gone back and they've had a look and they've actually found another one. Is it just one or two, or just one more? So, yeah, that one might be in trouble.
And that was about 2 days looking.
But friends or foes, it's all about perceptions. All parasites are bad, aren't they? I mean, tapeworms and fleas and ticks, they're terrible things. But, quandongs and Christmas trees, they're parasites. But do we think they're terrible like tapeworms and fleas and ticks? No, we want to keep our quandongs and our Christmas trees. And there's a perception that mistletoes kill their hosts. And that might be true sometimes, but it's not always true. And what made this tree sick? The average man would say, oh, look at all the mistletoes, that must be what's killing them. But have a closer look, and where are all the dead branches? They're all up here in the tops. They haven't got mistletoes on them, those dead branches. They couldn't support a mistletoe. But what has happened is that we've got a paddock there and probably got superphosphates, and we know native plants don't like the phosphates very much. They're very phosphorus sensitive. And we've got a road here which pollutes things, and we've got a drain to take away all the water that's coming there. So this poor old tree is probably suffering from lack of water, lots of pollutants and things like that. And it's probably not the mistletoes that are killing it. But obviously, if you've got a good supply of food in there, the mistletoe bird's going to hang around, so he's going to spread it, so you'll get lots of mistletoes in the tree. Sometimes I think that the mistletoes can kill plants, their hosts, but it's only in special cases. If you go up around northern York, you see all this Amyema preissii in all the jam trees along the roadsides, and a lot of the jams are dead, and people say, the mistletoes have killed them. Sure, there were mistletoes in them, and they might have been the final stick that broke the camel's back, but jam trees are relatively short-lived anyway. And so, they've got to, in nature, the thing that controlled mistletoe numbers probably was fire. Occasional fires going through was fine. But now there's no fire on those roadsides. Cockies wouldn't want you lighting up the roadside beside their paddock in that time of year when the weedy grasses underneath will actually burn. So there's nothing to regenerate. There's no stimulus to regenerate the jam. So the jams are all old and senescing. And sure, the mistletoes are making hay. So parasites always get a bit of a hold on something that's already a bit sick. It's much easier. It's the same as if you've got the flu, you're much more susceptible to get other things too, because your resistance is down. And so in places you can actually mistletoes can actually be the final coup de grace that knocks it out. But it was on its way out anyway. It was senescing. An interesting variant on this is if you go up to the Quangan, up around Inhabit, areas like that, you get the prickly bark trees, the Eucalyptus todtiana, and they very often have Amyema muquelii, this same mistletoe growing in them. And I've seen them where they've got really sick crowns and very heavy mistletoe infestations. And you put a fire through occasionally, and the trees get beautiful healthy crowns again, the mistletoes are gone. And I sometimes wonder if in fact that isn't telling us something, that Quangan does occasionally need a fire. So fires are interesting, it's a problematic issue. But friends, they feed the birds, and butterflies feed on them. Some of our most beautiful butterflies that we saw at the beginning, their larvae feed on mistletoes. The things that pollinate the mistletoes or live on the mistletoes will obviously be the pollinators of other plants. And they also, the bird disperse seeds. Mistletoe birds aren't the only birds that eat mistletoe seeds. In the more arid country, the spiny-cheeked honeyeaters in particular are mistletoe specialists. They often get them around mistletoes. And they tend to fly much longer distances. The mistletoe bird, the seed goes through a mistletoe bird in about 10, 12 minutes. So it doesn't have time to go very far. And they're not philanthropic enough to see how far they can get before they plant a seed in a burnt area. They mess with this tree's got lots of mistletoes in it, I'll stick around this tree. There's food here, I'll stay here. So the mistletoe birds don't actually disperse them very far. It's things like spiny-cheeked honeyeaters, which probably are the things that take them long distances, because they take much longer to go through a spiny-cheeked honeyeater than they do a mistletoe bird. And they tend to be much more mobile than the mistletoe birds anyway. And nutrient recycling, there's a guy called David Ward in South Australia who's done some very interesting stuff with mistletoes. And apart from anything else, he's shown that mistletoes are particularly favoured by birds for nest sites. He's got a fantastic database of all the birds that he's found nesting in mistletoes, and it's a very extensive list. But he's also done some work on nutrient recycling. And mistletoe leaves don't have any of those hard tannins and oils that the eucalypt leaves have. So when they fall, they tend to decompose much more quickly than eucalypt leaves, which means that you get much more rapid recycling of nutrients. And David's found that in places where you get fairly good mistletoe populations, the rapid turnover, because of the more frequent decomposition of the mistletoe leaves, there's actually better nutrient in the rest of the leaves. And he's found that bird numbers in areas with good mistletoe populations actually are higher than areas with no mistletoes. And that includes things that have nothing to do with mistletoes. They don't eat mistletoes. They're just benefiting from the extra nutrient that's getting into the things, into the eucalypts and the other bushes that provide food for them, or that provide food for insects that the birds eat. So wherever mistletoes cause problems, humans have been in there and they've upset the balance of nature. And interrupted natural processes, we've got too much or too little fire, we've got herbivores and frugivores we've introduced in New Zealand, or we've eradicated over here. And we've introduced lots of new hosts. This Amyema preissii loves the exotic eastern states acacias. Fortunately, it's not the silver bullet that's going to wipe out these weedy things, because the acacias grow up and produce seed before the mistletoes really get a hang in there. So they might be able to knock them off in the end, but not until the acacias have seeded well. And then we've got lots of pollutants, including phosphates. We've altered hydrologies. So conclusions, besides being beautiful, mistletoes are native. They're important ecologically. They're in trouble in some places, and they're mistaken for pests in other places. So let's keep a balanced mind. A few acknowledgements. I've shown photos from not only mine, but from Bill Muir, Joff and Joan Stark, Kevin Teeley, Tom Vigilante, and I've had wonderful collecting assistance from people like Joff and Joan and a host of other people who've gone out in the bush with me and put up with me saying, stop, 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 there's a mistletoe, and making very short journeys very long. And thank you for your patience. There's just a few of the things that are associated with mistletoes. Thank you.